And Anthony, you can get started whenever you are ready.
Okay, great. Well, I see people coming in. There we go. Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute as people are in the middle of joining. I see people are still joining, so we're just going to give it another minute before we get started. Okay, why don't we get started? I see that I think there are a couple of people still straggling in, but let me get us started so that we don't fall behind too much. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining. I am super excited to be here. This is the second in the Racial Justice Research and Practice dialogues that are put on by John Jay College's Office for the Advancement of Research in collaboration with the Office of Undergraduate Studies. I am Anthony Carpi, Dean of Research. Last month, we launched this series with a panel and a follow-up workshop exploring how racism can affect students' health and mental health. And we learned some pedagogical tools to better address these issues in the classroom. Today, we'll be discussing the harms that are done when individuals of color don't see themselves represented in the historical narrative. And in turn, we'll be looking at course curricula and how this can be affected by this lack of representation. We're honored to have three scholars here today who can draw from their scholarship to shed light on this. First, Dr. Paul Ortiz, faculty member in the University of Florida's History Department and author of the award-winning book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States. Thank you, Paul, for being with us here.
Thank you.
And second, John Jay's Dr. Suzanne Oboler, a professor of Latinx studies whose primary research focuses on racism and immigration and the issue of belonging in the Americas. Welcome, Suzanne. Nice to see you again. And finally, I'd like to introduce another faculty member, Dr. Edward Paulino, who teaches in our history department. Dr. Paulino will facilitate today's session. Ed's research focuses on race, genocide, borders, nation building, and the African diaspora, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. He is author of Dividing Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic's border campaign against Haiti, 1930 to 1961, a book about Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, his racialization of the 20th century border conflict between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Dividing Hispaniola was featured in an OAR book talk in 2018. Ed is also the author and star of a solo play entitled Eddie's Perejil, which also deals with bloody border conflicts between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he is founder of the Borders of Light, an organization that commemorates victims of cross-border violence in Hispaniola and promotes solidarity between Haitians and Dominicans. So please join me in thanking and welcoming these three exceptional scholars for being here. I'm so looking forward to today's discussion and the ways we can make our own teaching more equitable and representative. With that, Ed, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Dr. Carpi. I really appreciate the invitation to be a moderator here. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Daniel Stageman and Rachel Friedman, the Office of Advanced Research, Dr. Anthony Carpi, Dean of Research, Dr. Dara Byrne, Associate Provost and Dean for Undergraduate Study, the Faculty Leadership Committee members, Dr. Jose Luis Morin, Dr. Jessica Gordon, Nimhard, and Dr. Monica Son, also Provost Dr. Yi Li, all for acknowledging the zeitgeist or zeitgeists of the moment, which for today's panel centers on the erasure of people of color from historical mainstream narratives as it relates to the United States and the Americas and higher education. This erasure and the way stories are told continues today writ large, as seen today in the recent US presidential elections. As Juan Gonzalez, the author of Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, and a journalist for Democracy Now!, and a professor at Rutgers, has written, quote, "The key narrative of this election is not whether there was a small shift in the percentage of Latinx voters in some areas of the country turning toward Trump. The main story is that in an election which saw historic turnout, people of color, and especially Latinos, had an unprecedented increase in voting. And they, not white voters, represented the bulk of that increase. Virtually none of the reports have mentioned this, that for the first time in US history, Latinos turnout, the turnout of Latinos, appears to have reached comparable levels to the rates for white and Black Americans. 20.6 million Latinos went to the polls in this election. That's 64% of the 32 million eligible Latinx voters. While in previous election cycles, the turnout had been routinely below 50%. In raw numbers, 8 million more Latinos voted this year than in 2016. That's a 63% increase over the last presidential elections." End quote. Today, the failure of erasure is more relevant than ever, as we are seeing in the President of the United States attempting to erase the electoral victory of President-elect Joe Biden, and Vice President Kamala Harris. And just like citizens of a democracy who don't see themselves reflected across all levels of society, and the pain and harm that erasure causes not just on the human psyche, but on the GDP of a nation, so too students, whether in K through 12 programs or higher education, will negatively be impacted when the historical narrative of a country continues to be interpreted in myopically cynical and political ways. As a Dominican American, Latino, and a historian with a PhD trained in Latin America and the Caribbean, for the last nearly 20 years, I've been teaching students about erasure through my 2 signature courses that I created and are the only ones that are taught at CUNY: The History of Genocide and The History of Genocide in Latin America and the Caribbean. Genocide, it can be argued, is the limit on the spectrum of exclusion and erasure. Until recently, whether it is the massacre of Afro-Cubans in 1912, the Tulsa Race Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 in the US, or the 1937 Haitian Massacre in the Dominican Republic, to the countless of murders of Black and Indigenous people by the state in the United States and across the Americas, such as law enforcement, predatory, genocidal, transgenerational, and transnational histories have been erased from the mainstream narrative taught to citizens. As the only Latino in the Department of History at John Jay, and one of only 2 tenured Latino professors since the founding of the college, you can imagine the meta and countless conversations I've had over the years with many students as we shared a common experience of growing up in public housing, and the surprising number of times in my classes that my students discovered the more unsavory historical events of their ancestral homes, who up to that point in their lives, those ancestral places were a destination to escape their New York City hood, in my case, the crack epidemic in the 80s, where they would visit the sunny Caribbean beaches during Christmas. there is a wonder and pain of not knowing. But once the students learn new histories, they become more empowered. And one of my goals as a practitioner of a Freirean pedagogy is for them to become more critically engaged. This is why I was so excited to have been asked to moderate this panel, because of the two eminent scholars we have with us today, Dr. Suzanne Oboler and Dr. Paul Ortiz, who have dedicated their personal and scholarly lives to making visible the lives and struggles of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And they are, and we are fortunate that they will share with us the challenges they faced and face, and perhaps some solutions in slowing or eliminating the reproduction of power and privilege in all its forms. First, we have Suzanne Oboler, who's a professor of Latin American Latinx Studies at John Jay College of the City University of New York. Her current research and teaching interests center on human rights in the Americas, focusing on racism, immigration, citizenship, and belonging. She is the author of Ethnic Labels, Latino Lives, Identity and the Politics of Representation in the United States, and several articles and book chapters, most recently. She has also edited a few anthologies, including Latinos and Citizenship, The Dilemma of Belonging and Behind Bars, Latino, Latinas, and Prison in the United States. She co-edited Neither Enemies Nor Friends, Latinos, Blacks, Afro-Latinos with Anani Di Dizienyo. She has also co-edited 2 Oxford encyclopedias on Latinx in the US, most recently the Oxford Encyclopedia of Latinos and Latinas in Contemporary Politics, Law, and Social Movements. In 2002, she became the founding editor of the journal Latino Studies, which she edited for 10 years. In 2011, she was named Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Studies at the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She currently serves on the executive board of the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute. Dr. Paul Ortiz is a director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and professor of history at the University of Florida. He serves on the Faculty Advisory Council for the University of Florida Center for Latin American Studies. His book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, was identified by Bustle as one of the 10 books about race to read instead of asking a person of color to explain things to you. Paul co-edited Remembering Jim Crow, African Americans Tell About Life in the Segregated South, which received the Lillian Smith Book Award from the Southern Regional Council. Paul has published essays in Latino Studies, Cultural Dynamics, Oral History Review, and many other journals. He has been interviewed by Agencia de Noticias del Estado Mexicano, ADR German Radio and Television, Newsweek, and many, many more on social movements, immigration, etc. He is a third-generation military veteran and a first-generation university graduate. His pathway to academia included years of organizing with the United Farm Workers, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, AFSCME, and many other unions. He is currently president of the United Faculty of Florida, FEA, NEA, AFT, AFL-CIO, the union that represents tenured and non-tenured track faculty at the University of Florida. Paul is the faculty advisor for the University of Florida Dream Defenders, Por Colombia, Chispas Students for Bernie, and many other student organizations. In 2013, he received the Cesar E. Chavez Action and Commitment Award from the Florida Education Association, AFL-CIO. And he's currently writing a book called Settler Colonialism and the War on Terror, 1492 to the Present, which will be published by Beacon Press. So this talk will be a 2-part conversation, and I will ask both panelists initial questions to get us started, and we have about 50 minutes to hear from them, and then we can open it up for questions. We'll have about 20-25 minutes for Q&A. My first question is for Professor Oboler. Could you please begin by telling us really, if you had to tell students who might be listening now, like, what is the main crux of your research all these years? I think you are mute.
Yeah, I just unmuted. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Dan and Stageman and Anthony Carpi and Rachel Friedman for this wonderful invitation. It is an honor to be here. It is an honor to be here with Paul and with Ed, for sure. scholars that I really, really admire very much, and I'm very happy to have this conversation with. I also, before I begin, just want to acknowledge the passing of my very good friend and colleague, Anani Chigenyo from Ghana, who was a real pioneer in the study of Blackness in the Americas, and very wonderful scholar, wonderful friend, wonderful writer, and also spectacular mentor of so many generations, literally generations of students. So I just want to acknowledge that and ask that we maybe dedicate this panel to him with your blessing. So about me. I arrived in the United States in 1984, and even though I'm not a historian, context is very important. And so a few years before, in 1977, the Office of Management and Budget divided this national community of the United States into 5 basically statistical populations. And, the common names for them, Black African American, White European, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native American, and Hispanic. And when I arrived shortly thereafter, I was told that I was a Hispanic and I fit into that population category. And that really raised a lot of questions for me. First of all, what is a Hispanic? Second, what does it mean to become suddenly, overnight, a Hispanic? Who gains and who loses from this sudden reconfiguration of this national community of citizens and residents into statistical categories? And I say statistical categories because it was so strange. For example, yes, Hispanics was made up of people of Latin American descent, but it also included Spain. It also included Native people of the Americas. They were not in the Native American category. And so that's why I'm calling it a statistical population. It was a population that was just suddenly grouped together and told that they are the group. And obviously, one of the things I was doing in the 80s was I was a union organizer and very much aware that none of the problems that existed before this separation of the people into different categories had gone away. For example, poverty was still around, and so was all the racial injustices that hadn't changed, and the education inequalities, and the housing inequities. None of that had changed, but all of a sudden, on top of that, there was this sudden division of people into different groups, and there was resources attached to this division, to this categorization. And that's why I was asking, who gains and who loses? And just to give you one example, the civil rights movements had just finished. And one of the key things about the civil rights movements that people are not that aware of is that while the African American civil rights movement certainly led the entire, I think, era, they were not, this did not mean that the other people of color were not organizing as well. And so you had movements, for example, of the Mexican Americans who came to be called Chicanos or Chicanas or Chicanexes as they're known now, and also Puerto Ricans. And these are 2 historical minorities. These are 2 populations within the Latino community who actually have been here as US citizens, but did not request to be here, right? They had been, they were not here, they're not here voluntarily, right? They're here by conquest, they're here by colonization. None of that information about their civil rights movements, about the fact that they are US citizens, about the fact that they've been here since 1848 in the United States, but certainly before that in case Mexican Americans or Puerto Ricans since 1898. None of that information is known publicly unless you are either a Puerto Rican or Mexican American or a specialist in the subject of ethnicity in the United States. It's not an issue that is really discussed. And so just as these two groups had affirmed and established their identity as being citizens with the right to have rights, you get this term Hispanic, which lumps them together with people like me, who was just a regular old immigrant from Peru coming to the United States, along with refugees and asylum seekers and other people, right, who are arriving to the United States. And so the result is that their history, which they had just managed to bring out in the open through their civil rights movements and to make national, was thrown again into invisibility, right? It was, to use the words of this panel, it was erased yet again, right? This was not the first time. So this is what I meant by who gains and who loses. And I've been tracing this for the past, I don't know, 30 years or 40 years, for many years, since the 80s, together with the understanding that because none of the other issues have been solved, we need to make alliances. And so that led me to research Blackness and the meaning of race and racialization in the hemisphere as a whole, because Latin Americans, when they come here, do not come here without their own racial and baggage.
Right.
And so you have to understand what is the relationship between people coming here, what happens when they get here and meet African Americans, for example.
So
how do we build alliances?
Right. So before I go to Paul, I just want to segue that it seems that Paul, Suzanne's research and your research predates the whole debacle of polling that we're seeing now, in terms of, we're understanding, Cubans might be different than Chicanos in the West, and that might inform how they vote. So Paul, in your book, you write, quote, "I wrote this book because as a scholar, I want to ensure that no Latinx or Black children ever again have to be ashamed of who they are and of where they come from." End quote. So could you give us a sense of, because your introduction is very powerful. Like Suzanne, what led you to research what you do?
Well, one of the people who led me is right here, my co-panelist, Suzanne, my sister in struggle and a guide and a mentor and a dear friend. And I just wanted to start by echoing Suzanne's dedication of the panel, the event, to our wonderful colleague Anani, who was also, I think the term Suzanne mentioned, a uniter, a person who brought people together. I grew up in a working class community, numerous different working class communities. And one of the things I've noticed about academia is there's so many divisions, there's so many tensions, and there are incentives to compete against each other. Anani didn't let any of that stop him from bringing us together. He was really a joiner and a person who made people feel comfortable. I'll never forget the first panel. Actually, I think Suzanne, you and Anani co-chaired it at the the National Sociological, American Sociological Convention. And I felt like a fish out of water because I'm not a sociologist, but you and Anani made me feel so welcome. I'm just so grateful for that. And I also really want to thank the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. It's really an honor to be here with you all. And Ed, as you mentioned earlier, I'm a third generation military veteran. A shout out to Veterans Today. It is Veterans Day.
Absolutely.
Part of my experiences I'll talk about in a second, but I was born in 1964 and I grew up in the 70s in what historians now call the backlash era. And I just touched upon this briefly in an African-American Latinx history of the United States. And I'm actually working on a more extensive essay. It was real tough for, people of color, for African-Americans, especially for Mexican Americans, Chicanos, as we called ourselves back then. It's amazing how the terms change over time, right? But it was a backlash era because we have an educational system in this country that teaches essentially a zero-sum theory of citizenship. It's both white nationalist, but it's also a narrative which says that if you gain rights, I lose rights. And unfortunately, that's how tens of millions of people are educated in this country. When we become movement organizers, like Suzanne mentioned earlier, becoming a union organizer, we learn something different. We learn different values. We learn these values that our ancestors brought from Mexico, from the Dominican Republic, from Haiti, from Eastern Europe, these values of mutuality, of solidarity. And those were on a positive side, those were the values that I learned growing up, which are very different than kind of the mainstream values that are often taught in the society. But we were brought up to be ashamed of where we were from. There was nothing about the history of Mexico in the schools I grew up in on the West Coast. Supposed to be so-called left coast, progressive era, right? Okay, but you have to remember when I was growing up, the people who were the governors of California, some of them went on to become presidents, were people like Ronald Reagan, Duke Majan, Pete Wilson, vicious racists, people who came to power by attacking Mexican Americans, by claiming that African Americans were lazy, that Mexicans were lazy. And this is one of the confusing things as a kid. I remember, imbibing these stereotypes, but the racism is so confusing for children. One of the confusing stereotypes was, on the one hand, we were told constantly in the 70s that we were lazy. And I think a lot of us, unfortunately, imbibed that kind of self-hatred. At the same time, we were told that we're stealing American jobs. And this was so contradictory. I remember being confused by it. And we've actually had a lot of Chicano stand-up comedians make jokes about this, right? How can, on the one hand, we be lazy? On the other hand, we're stealing all his jobs. It seems to be contradictory. But the big wake-up call for me, Ed, was not only that kind of youth growing up, but not being part of an academic community. We were told we weren't going to college. And I remember one time, my senior year, going in to talk to a guidance counselor and I asked the question, because I was receiving college catalogs and I had taken a pre-SAT. And I was told very bluntly, well, Paul, college isn't for everyone. Wasn't your father in the Marines? I think you should go in the military instead. So that was my pathway. And I ended up in Central America in the mid-1980s. And this was an enormous wake-up call for me, because nothing that I had ever done in my life prepared me to be, sergeant and special forces in Central America in the middle of civil wars that my own country was stoking and trying to promote. And then getting the wake-up call about, wow, the US is so different from seeing through the eyes of people from Honduras, from Colombia, from Venezuela, and other countries that I was in. And people were very assertive in talking with me, and they would say, young man, why are you here? I had a certain mission. The mission I was in Special Forces was supposedly to bring democracy to Central America, which is laughable. I had never even voted my entire life. I was 20 years old, man. And, and this idea that I could bring democracy into a region which actually invented democracy in the 18th century was laughable. But I was taught, and I was trained early on, I think, by leaving the US, that we have to if we're going to ever learn to teach US history more objectively, more inclusively, we have to either be able to leave the country physically and look at this country through the eyes of people in places like Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean. We have to either be able to do that physically, like I did, quite by accident in a way, as a soldier of empire, or we have to do it imaginatively. But we have to stop doing the same white nationalist historical narrative. People wonder why white nationalism has enjoyed a disturbing, rejuvenation in this country. Part of it, Ed, is the historical narrative. We continue, this is going to sound facetious, but when I was a kid, when I was in second and third grade, our teachers would dress us up like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. They put powdered wigs on us. They'd have us dance and say these lines. that had nothing to do with our ancestors. And unfortunately, we're still doing the same thing. We're dressing up like Alexander Hamilton, dancing on a stage, making stuff up, and it isn't working. In fact, it's really causing another backlash that my students, and then this is the thing that hurts me so much, and part of the other animating factor of writing the book the way I wrote it is I have many Haitian American students, many Cuban American students, African American students, and they constantly tell me, Ed, you know, where are our people in this narrative?
Yeah.
We're not here. Where are they? And so I just can't, you know, it's like Bastilla, we used to say in the farm worker movement. How can we stop this?
Yeah, well, so yeah, that's a great point. I mean, so many things, right? Like, you know, historically, you know, we have a history 240 historiography at the history department, and I tell students, you know, it's historiography is about how, you know, the things that have been written about a particular a history, right? There's economic history, there's Marxist history, right? And it just reminds me that the narrative of the nation and what we teach in K through 12 and college is, or was supposed to be, and still is, a kind of balm for the nation, right? Remember Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilization, right? At Harvard, he used to argue that, right, one of the bombs of America, the United States of America, is this kind of white Anglo-Saxon ethos, right? And I think that's why there is so much resistance against programs like ethnic studies, right? Or talking about the American empire from other perspectives, right? Because it said, like, you had kind of the John Wayne and Gary Cooper version of how to unite Americans, but what happens when you remove that, right? What do you replace that with, right? So that's my question for you, right? So I had two things. One is, what are the historical moments? You touched upon that, right? And I think one historical moment in terms of erasure, what Suzanne's body of work has tried to grapple with, which is labeling, right? You know, Latino or Hispanic name kind of erasing all these other groups, as we just saw right now in the presidential elections, but also this historical moment, such as, you know, I remember, what's his name, Robert Rodriguez, at the McNear-Lehrer report on PBS, saying once, he said, Nixon is my father, right? You know, as a way to tell people that that's when that category began in the 70s, right? So how do we know the erasures are there, right? That we should be talking more about, right? Toussaint Louverture also, and juxtaposing it with George Washington, right? And what does independence and freedom mean? So we know some of these erasures. How do we engage with our students to make visible the invisible? How do you do that on an individual level as an educator? And then how do you necessarily have to do it with via institutions? Suzanne?
That's quite a question. So you're right about the many historical moments of erasure. If you don't know your history, if you don't know who you are, you can't ground yourself, right? The terms, I mean, it's bad enough already to not have Mexican American studies, Puerto Rican studies, Latino studies taught in schools. And I'm talking about high schools, right? Or elementary schools, really. So students come up, as Paul was saying, and, you know, the thing, you know, thinking about George Washington, but never understanding that, you know, Latin Americans and Latinos have their own people and leaders that they can look up to, that they can see themselves reflected in, that they can become, right? And so in the case, for example, I mean, here's just a basic one, you know, how many Americans know what happened? Everybody knows that there was a Mexican-American War, which, by the way, we don't call Mexican-American War because that sounds like it's the hyphenated Mexican-Americans, right? We call it the US-Mexico War. So how many people know what happened after the US-Mexico War? How many people know, for example, that the people who were living in what is now the Southwest actually were given US citizenship? I mean, it was disregarded, it was, ignored, it was whatever you want, but the people living there who were citizens of Mexico who decided not to leave the territory were granted US citizenship. So they are the first people of color to have US citizenship. How many people know that? Now, if you don't know that, what happens? Then you can come down a staircase, a golden staircase, and call Mexicans, right? Mexicans in general, criminals and everything else, right? And you can also assume that everybody is just an immigrant. Everybody just just arrived yesterday, right? And yet you have populations of Latinos who have been here longer than many of the white Europeans, right? But nobody knows that. Can you really have an American nation if you only know one tiny piece of that nation's history? That is just a question, right? So how do we engage with our students to make visible the invisible? For me, it's frontally. It's exactly what why I love Paul's book, for example, because that's what he did, right? He said, okay, wait, let's tell the same history that we learn in school from the point of view of Latinxes and African Americans. And let's see where that takes us. Let's see what is the information that we are going to uncover doing that. And I know you're probably going to be talking about this, Paul, but this is what I love about Paul's book, that, you ground people. You cannot ground people on a statistical name called Latino, which has no territorial belonging anywhere, right? There is nothing to actually put your feet on. I was born in Latino land. What is that, right? So the history will ground people, right? The history and the difference of the different groups, right? The fact that, for example, the Dominican Republic, how people there see racism, blackness, right, is so different from the way that Peruvians see blackness, right? Or, that Mexicans who have this cosmic race version of, black racism, everybody is going to see things differently. You learn it all, and then you come together, in alliance, not in statistics,
Yeah, so it's true. Piggybacking on that, Paul. So, right, how do you, as an educator, come up with different narratives and labels, knowing full well that on the one hand you have this push that ethnic studies has been kind of wanting people to claim and recognize for years, and on the other hand you have Goya, you have this community that can be leveraged to sell movies and J-Lo and so, right, and that's real, that's millions of dollars, right? And it's political power because Florida went for the Republican candidate for Trump. So as educators, right, because that's our wheelhouse, right? What does it take? If we're not going to have the white Anglo-Saxon idea of what America is, what is it? Is this something else cultural? The only thing I see is, a secular constitution that is godless, right? As Christopher Hitchens used to say. But does it start with some courses? Does it start with programs? Or are we talking about something more subversive, which is just revamping the entire higher educational system?
Well, I think it's all of the above, Ed. And one, part of it is just kind of echoing what Suzanne has just talked to us about. Part of it as scholars is to identify moments in time or events or individuals who we think we know or we think we knew, and to rethink them. And so writing African American and Latinx history in the United States was a humbling experience for me, because I can tell you, I thought I knew all about those time periods, talking about Reconstruction, the American Revolution, the New Deal, the election of Barack Obama, things like that. I thought I knew those things, but when I went back and studied them, I just had to throw out a lot of my assumptions. It was a humbling experience. That's one of the things we have to be ready to do, is to humble ourselves and to listen to other people's stories. This is what I really want to emphasize as an oral historian. I love archival research, but part of it is if we're primary, if we're K through 12 teachers, if we're college instructors, get the oral histories going. Encourage our students to talk to their parents, to their grandparents, you know, and to start talking about their ancestors. And Suzanne mentioned several different amazing diasporas of people into the place we now call the United States. Every one of those diasporas has an amazing history of struggle. Haiti, as you know, intersects everything. We all came through Haiti at one point. Haiti is what fueled our liberation struggles all throughout Latin America, Mexico, Cuba, the United States. But we don't know that. And so, I mean, that's why chapter 1 in that book is called the Haitian Revolution. It isn't called the American Revolution. I talk about the American Revolution. I don't advocate disappearing people like George Washington or Hamilton or Jefferson. They belong in that narrative. But what I'm saying is the Mexican War of Independence, which abolished slavery long before the United States did, should be in that narrative early on. Let me mention too about historical erasures, because in Florida, this is the week that we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Ocoee Election Day Massacre. And Ed, you mentioned the Tulsa Massacre in your opening comments. The past week, we at the Oral History Program at UF have been with community members in Ocoee, Florida, commemorating that horrific event. We've also been virtually with community members in Elaine, Arkansas, who are also commemorating the 101st anniversary of the Elaine Massacre. These were horrific events of historical erasure. These were attacks, white assaults on Black small property owning farmers and union members, where the end of the whole process saw African Americans lose tremendous amounts of wealth and property and labor that they had struggled for years to achieve. That whole time period between, you know, the East St. Louis Massacre of 1917 and the Rosewood Massacre in 1923, which happened the next county over from where I'm speaking to you from, was an effort to destroy Black political, economic, and social gains that African Americans had fought so hard to achieve. And until recently, we decided to forget about those events. Well, African Americans haven't forgot about those events. And at the event last week, this past weekend in Ocoee, Florida, many Black descendants whose ancestors were driven out of Ocoee by, and you have to remember, these weren't mobs that attacked African American communities in Tulsa or Elaine or Ocoee. These were military operations. And I know because I'm a third generation military veteran, I've broken this down. They were assaults carried out by law enforcement, white military veterans, the American Legion members, and they were again designed to take away property, take away political rights of African Americans. So one of the things we have to do, Ed, I think, is identify those events. And the good news is, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've gotten an enormous kind of kickstart, an enormous kind of, rejuvenation. The good news I want to share with everyone this morning is that, or this afternoon, it's at the high school level that we're seeing so many high school students, teachers, parents, community members demanding a new kind of curriculum that's inclusive, that talks about these events that have been erased, that bring this into these dialogues about how do we achieve racial justice today. That's where the momentum is. And so getting back to the original question, it's really all of the above. As a teacher, I'm like, of course it has to be courses, right? But there are many other things as well.
Really quickly, I've been thinking the same thing. I've been at LG for 20 years, but more than 35 years, you take graduate school, teaching history. And I'm thinking maybe my next book should be geared to high school students, right? But this goes to the question, and Suzanne, you can jump on, and that is, how does a culture of academia, undermine or help? Why? because I'm an associate professor, right? But to get to full or to have prestige in the academy as a professor, right? To get full professor, I need a book, single authored monograph, preferably maybe, you know, not a vanity publishing press, but like Oxford University Press, right? If I teach a high school textbook, it's not bling in my, right? Like Eric Forner, right? That's the kind of, you know, the goal, right? But if we want to really engage, I think it would have to be at the high school level. And I've been grading AP high school, you know, global history exams for years. So what does that mean? Does that mean that it's not just that higher education has to change in how you teach history, Suzanne, but does it mean that necessarily in the 21st century, what higher education does has to always be connected with high school, right? Before the history departments in college start acting and creating the curriculum, we have to speak with the high schools at the state level, Suzanne?
Well, I mean, I think we should always be speaking to the high schools because the high school students are eventually going to be our students. You know, in the 21st century, to me, we all have to change. I mean, it is ridiculous that we are teaching in the same way that we were at the beginning of the 20th century, right? I mean, nothing has changed in terms of what we're teaching or what we consider to be, you know, legitimate knowledge or anything like that. Basically, I would argue, because of the internet, our students are teaching themselves and know a lot. People always complain that students don't read, for example, right? They read a lot. They know a lot. And so for us to be the ones that have the knowledge while they don't, I mean, the first thing I would do is go to Paul's high schools and say to them, where are you getting this information from? Where is all of this? You know, we need to talk about racial justice. Where is that coming from? And, you know, I know it's easy to say this if you are at the end of your career, but follow your passion, Ed, when it comes to, you know, I mean, not just you, but, you know, my response to you, to all academics is follow your passion, you know, and you will get tenure and you
Right.
will get, you know, you will get advanced because you are following your passion.
Right, but Suzanne, I might follow my passion, but we still have the situation where, you know, I can follow my passion, you know, I love surfing, but, you know, I'm talking more about structural change, right? That if we're going to stick with nation state models, that when the world sees an American student in 2060 says, I have to be careful when you get into a discussion with an American student, because they're going to come prepared. They're going to know about the connections between the Caribbean and Empire and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Toussaint Louverture, but also Muddy Waters. And they're going to have, right, this kind of holistic Rashomon, different perspectives. That's very critical. But that, for the far right, it doesn't have to undermine the nation, right? Right. So Paul, for me, it's structurally, what does that mean? Does that mean that every, not just high school, but every college like John Jay, before the student graduates, has to go through a required oral history program or course where they have to interview the oldest person in their community, and then you create an archive, right? Like, I'm thinking about ways that are viable and that are not kind of quantum physics level, but fractions.
I think it's really important for us to keep pushing for real structural change. So it's not just the question of having professors who know like Paul knows, who know like you or I know, you know, about the Latinx experience, you know, or lived experience. It's not enough, right? The entire system has to change so that it's not the white establishment at the top and, you know, a tiny, minute number of Latinx professors or African-American professors or something like that in certain departments, right? Kind of sprinkled like, what's it called? Parmesan cheese on, it's not like that. It has to change everything from the bottom up, which is the follow your passion part, and from the top down, which means getting people in place who can actually, who know what is needed.
Okay, right, Suzanne. Right, that's a great point. Because so Paul, how do you, if we were to invite you to come and talk, how do you again? How would you like explain to someone, not the humanities, that's a given, but for example, John Jay, which is very well known worldwide for criminal justice, for say those faculty, and especially, and the provost will be there, the president, right? It's institutional. How do you get the people in science, forensics, right? How do you get their buy-in? Because I remember years ago, I had a student when I used to teach at the ISP program. Now it's a department, but interdisciplinary studies program. And I had a student who was hardcore science forensics. And we were looking at, I don't know, an Ariel Dorfman novel about Chile and that disappeared. And she looks at me and she says, we're discussing, and she goes, Professor, why am I reading a novel? I'm a scientist. I'm with the labs, right? And I said, well, if, I do forensics. I said, if you're going to ever exhume bodies, you're not just going to need like the lab and the tools. You're going to need the cultural, Suzanne, the anthropological background to understand when you exhume the remains of a Mayan indigenous person in Guatemala, and the clothing and all that, you need to get a sense, right? It's this kind of steam. So how, Paul, do you get a buy-in for people that says, I don't teach that?
Yeah. Well, I think, Ed, you touched on it earlier, and you just touched on it again when the important story or anecdote about Guatemala. I would tell our colleagues at John Jay the same thing I tell my colleagues at UF, that I've told folks all throughout the country that I've been talking to the last 2 years, which is that, colleagues, the world is changing underneath our feet even as we speak. And the students that are coming into our classrooms today are different than my generation of students coming into the classroom, right? The students coming to our classrooms today have heightened expectations. Let me tell you a brief story. Right next door in Connecticut, the entire state is in an amazing posture right now, changing its high school curriculum so that by next year, you will be required as a high school student to take a course in African American history, Latinx history, and Puerto Rican history. These are not electives anymore. Like all my life as a scholar, I've done teachers' workshops where when I'm teaching ethnic studies, I'm teaching it with the realization that these are teachers who are teaching these courses as electives. No longer. These are required courses. When you finish a high school degree in the state of Connecticut, you will learn something about the cultures of West Africa in the 14th century. You will learn something about indigenous cultures in the Americas long before the Europeans set foot on this continent. You will learn about the intersectionality of African and different Latin American and Caribbean diasporas. So those are the high school students that you all are going to start having very soon. I'm sure you already have them. Those are the high school students, or those are the college students that we have already are getting increasingly at the University of Florida. So it gets back to the point earlier I made about how high school students and the worlds they come from are changing. I can share so many anecdotes. Let me share an anecdote from an assistant superintendent of the school system for a county that serves about 250,000 students, called me about a month ago. And so much of this, Ed, has been driven by the Black Lives Matter movement. I can't even tell you. It makes my heart so inspired, because I often tell people what we used to call Hispanic Heritage Month is usually my second busiest month of the year. Usually the busiest month of the year for me is Black History Month, because I'm constantly traveling, giving lectures. This Hispanic Heritage Month, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, I did at least 3 times as many lectures, anti-racist workshops, both with schools, community organizations, especially especially in Latino communities, workshops on anti-Black racism in Chicago, in Miami, in Los Angeles, in Seattle. And that's what I mean. The Black Lives Matter movement has opened up this new space to study historical erasure, to study the intersections of African-American history, Latino history, and STEM, and things like that. So let me just conclude this part by sharing this anecdote with you. So I'm talking to this assistant superintendent, and I don't see her, and we're talking on the phone, and I'm thinking in my mindset, my prejudices, well, I have prejudices, right? So I'm thinking, well, I'm talking to an assistant superintendent, so that's a certain kind of individual. And then she just starts going off, and she says, we need to replace our social studies curriculum in my district, Professor Ortiz. It is so outmoded and so boring. She said, I'm so tired, Professor Ortiz, of walking into my middle school and high school classes, social studies classes, and seeing children with their heads on the desk, tuning out. She said, my district has just transitioned into a majority school district. Do you have characters? You mentioned Toussaint Louverture, Jose Morelos, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Mary McLeod Bethune, the list could go on and on. She said, do you have individuals of color, that was the term she used, historical individuals of color that you can talk to my teachers about that can help wake my students up? And the last thing she said to me is, Professor Ortiz, the more I think about this country, she said, I never would have said this just 4 or 5 months ago. But you know what? I think this country needs a revolution. What do you think? And I thought, well, wait for it. Wow, ma'am, you may be right. This country may need a revolution, because it gets back, and I wanted to share that story with you because it gets back to what will it take? And Suzanne's point, it's going to take everything. But one more thing I want to add to is that you can't do it alone. Colleagues, you cannot do this alone. You need to find supportive colleagues. You mentioned tenure. This is an important discussion for K through 12 teachers in states that have tenure. This is an important discussion for workers who have security of employment, or professors. Find other people to work with. Don't try to do it as an individual kind of bourgeois heroic person. You got to have, it's got to be, and I base this again, I think Suzanne probably would echo me here on my experience as a union organizer. Change doesn't happen by just individual heroic people doing things, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Since our time is limited, unfortunately, I'm going to start just opening it up to some of the questions and answers. But quickly, yes, I think this revolution of pedagogy and revolution of seeing the world in different ways. I always remember what Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote Blink and Outliers, he used to say, he says, when you're approached by a new idea and you roll your eyes, the end is nigh, right? And as a 51-year-old, I'm 51 and I was born in 69, I am learning to embrace things at a kind of heterosexual, kind of straight, guy, Latino, but 51-year-old. I, like you said, I am emboldened and inspired by the young, by the 20 and 30-year-olds. So I think the buy-in is, how do you get particularly older faculty, older administrators that could be as progressive as anybody else, but really we all have disciplinary biases and limitations, right? And so I think it's how do you get there? How do you transition, right? So one of the viewers said, to many, the word of culture civilization means Western, quote unquote. How do you teach a K through 12 program where students are, one, exposed to their rich heritage, and two, proud of these heritages? Then a movement of demand or more, something like that. So I don't know if any of you want to unpack that.
Could you repeat that?
Yes. How do you teach K through 12 students? in terms of correcting these erasures by exposing them to their rich heritage or heritages. How do you go about that? You know, not just, you know, as an educator, but also, you know, as a school, as you know, John Jay. It's like, okay, we're ready. We're a Hispanic serving institution. You know, we're presupposing that we're ready, but it's an institution. It's slow. We have to, you know, there's different interests. There's the state. There's, you know, we have faculty. There's the structure of adjuncts, and who are more adjuncts than regular tenured folk. And so, you know, we know that in the end, it is important to kind of diversify, open up for equity, for justice, to make us stronger as a nation. But the devil's in the details, right? How would you do that at the individual, professor, department, district, right, level, college?
Are you going to go? You want to start, Paul?
Well, I think
Go ahead, Paul.
It's a wonderful question. You know, as a movement historian, I'm like, okay, school's open. Let's have a round. You know, I wish we were sitting in a round circle, right? And we could just kind of kick this around, because it would be the kind of question where we would say, well, there's no way for one individual to answer that question. What you know, as a historian, I think of the Chicano Blowouts in 1968 in East Los Angeles, where really courageous high school students, most of them Chicano, but also white and African-American students, walked out of their classrooms demanding what? Demanding really the right to read more and to study more, because they wanted to learn about their people's histories, their people's cultures, which were not reflected in the curriculum of Los Angeles school district at that time. Then those students matriculated. Some of them went to Vietnam. Some of them went to the University of California system. One of them, Carlos Munoz, one of my dear mentors and guides, became a co-founder of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. And the example that I'm giving is just, he was part of this whole generation of people who fought and struggled. And today, I think the reason I mentioned the Connecticut example is to get that new curriculum in place. There's been well over 100 educators at all different levels in order to get this new requirement of African-American, Latinx, and Puerto Rican studies into the high school system. It involves teachers at a very basic level. Teachers for the last 2 or 3 decades have been dissed over and over again by so-called educational reform efforts, right? So I've been so happy to be part of this effort in Connecticut, where teachers are at the center of the effort. And then you get people like us, people who may have content area in Haiti and Brazil, in other parts of history and culture. But then you can't forget the students. Please do not forget the students. We have to involve our students at every level. We have to involve the parents at really every level. And we'll be very surprised. It's going to be messy at first, that always is. But when you bring everyone, as many people as you can to the table, and we use these skills, again, as community and labor organizers, right? But it takes a while, but again, you can't do it individually.
So Suzanne, I'm going to let you maybe have the last word, a penultimate word. But what do you think about what Paul's saying? And I mean, can we have hope?
You know, I love what Paul is saying. I love especially involve the students and the parents. When in my classroom, you know, people are coming kind of without information, but there are not just Latinx people, right? I mean, there's Latinx, there's African Americans, there's Asian Americans, there's white European students. We have everything in the class, right? And, you know, so how do you negotiate that, right? How do you teach to this rich heritage? Because you're not just teaching, I'm assuming, I don't know, Latinx, or you're not just teaching African American. The thing for me is alliances, right? I mean, you cannot, Latinos do not live in a void, right? I remember when I was teaching at Brown, I would ask the entire class, right? Wherever you are, because these students came from Alaska and Wyoming and South Dakota, as much as they did from New York City, inner city. And I would say to them, suppose that somebody comes from outer space and says to you, what is a Hispanic? And so, I would get the answers from everywhere. And from New York City, the answer was, it is an African American who's down. That is what a Latinx person is. And so you're basically taking students and you're saying to them, go and ask your parents, right, who you are, where you come from, what they know, get them involved in your education in that way, right? Even if, they may not be able to get involved with the algebra or whatever, but they can certainly ground you in their experience, and then come back and share that and see if it's similar, if it matches, where it differs from everybody else, so that you can locate yourself in that classroom with other people, right? And see where are the commonalities, where are the differences. I mean, at the most, teacher level, that's where I would begin, right? But then you do have to take it into the structural level, right? You have to have a will in the school, that is going to actually take this and do it properly, because it can't just be in one classroom like this and in another classroom like that, right? It has to be a concerted effort that, yes, it's going to be messy, as Paul says, but who cares? It's certainly better than having kids, with their head on, what did you say? Their head on well, half asleep, that image is horrendous, right? But I've seen it. I've seen it.
It's in a way kind of, our students show us, and it sounds a lot like kind of like CUNY, right? Historically, right? Where you have all these, working class kids. First it was white ethnics, and then, it was free, but then you have more people of color, which is the majority. But really, the kind of the socioeconomic realities challenging what we think is supposed to be an educator, right? Because I did in 2000, I did the oral history summer program at Columbia University. I still got the certificate. Nice. I remember, and we had to interview people, and it was like amazing. And I actually met this young woman, white woman from Ohio, from a place I can never forget, neither will you, called Wapakoneta. Wapakoneta, Ohio. And we're here on a bench in Riverside Park because of this program, and we're just talking. So the power of oral history, I know in high school, one of my mentors, her name is Jessica Siegel. She taught at my high school, Seward Park High School, and she has a book. They wrote a book about Samuel Friedman, who used to at Columbia University, and a journalist wrote a book about her called Small Victories. She later went on to teach at Brooklyn College, and she just retired. I remember her way of teaching was unorthodox, meaning she taught oral histories. We had the Lower East Side recipe book where all the students, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cantonese-speaking Chinese kids, African-Americans from the South, etc., some Italian kids, some Jewish kids, got together and interviewed their families. And we got this amazing book. And I can't tell you how powerful that was for us in terms of, what it did for us, because it validated who we were. And so perhaps we have to rethink about what being an educator is, or a historian. A historian is not being at, let's say, Harvard, teaching one course every semester, and my value is about just publishing books, right? There's a value to publishing books. I love reading books. I want to publish books. Librarians, they're great. But I think in the 21st century, at least for me, what I hope is that being an educator is to be more holistic. I don't know if the students I've had are able today, who graduated, are able to write a topic sentence. I don't know if they write grammatically well. I hope they do, right? I don't know. But what I do know is that if you ask most of them, they're going to say, when I was in the classroom, Paulino did three things. He told me a story. He performed acting out with exercises. And three, I inspired them. That's what I do. That's my passion, Suzanne. I inspire you. And I happen to be a historian. So I think it has to break out. Like, I don't want to go, like, if Harvard calls me, I probably won't go because you know what they did with Loria, our friend, ethnic studies. But that's not the model anyway. The model for value of giving back to a society is not the ivory tower. It's really closer to what CUNY is, I think, and to spaces where Paul is, that has created, right? Paul, you could be on the New York Times bestseller list, but you know what? That's not the goal. The goal is, look at all those organizations, just Suzanne, that you're connected to, that are not scholarly or academic. So I think we have to break through that. With that, I want you to have just one last word, you and Suzanne. We got 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. I would like to really highly recommend that everybody takes seriously the knowledge that your students at whatever level, whether it's, you know, K or 12 or college or senior, that they bring to the classroom. You know, I mean, in my class, I teach a class on civil rights. I have now gotten to the point where I teach the background, and I give them, you know, the civil rights movements of the 60s, which is now, you know, at least 50 years away, you know, or more, right? 60 years away. And then they give me what's going on with the civil rights today in different groups, whether it's LGBTQ or education. I mean, they do the research for today because they have lived it and they know it and they've read about it and they've been interested in it. And so why wouldn't they know more about it from that point of view of experiential knowledge than I do? And so, okay, let's share, let's learn, let's think about how to think about the information rather than, you know, you sitting there pretending you have nothing in your head and me giving it all to you to, you know, throw into your head. You know, that's the old-fashioned way, right? It's more now I want to learn how to, you know, give me the information and let's talk about how to think about it. You know? And I think that is a much more, regardless of where you're teaching, what level.
Correct.
So
that's right.
My recommendation.
Thank you, Suzanne. Paul?
CUNY, you know, colleagues at CUNY, students, community supporters, you're doing the work already. I mean, CUNY is the backbone of education in this country. And yes, you know, Paulo Freire, remembering our students bring all this amazing knowledge into our classrooms. We're not the experts. The definition of an intellectual that I was taught by my mentors, people like Angela Davis, people like Carlos Munoz, you really become an intellectual when you can acknowledge how little you really know, and that opens you up to learning, right? Oral history, what I love about it is in, Ed, you mentioned the Columbia program, which is incredible. I love the Columbia program. I'm lecturing there next week. Transcribing, doing an interview and being able to transcribe it and having that quiet space and reflection, it's an amazing experience. I typed in the chat bar, the Oral History Association has guides, and we have members who are primary school educators, who are museum people. So, you know, let's just all get involved and let's just help each other out and really lean on each other and be supportive for each other, be there for each other. And I think that's the key. Yeah.
Well, you know, that's a great point to end on. As I told Paul and Suzanne, the problem won't be starting, it will be ending, because we can talk for hours and if there's wine, even more. But I really am so grateful and appreciative of the opportunity to create this space and this conversation. I'm really grateful to my colleagues, to Paul and Suzanne and everyone at John Jay. You know, we're good people and we're trying to do our best. And I think, you know, we're committed to our students. And yes, the older you get, the part of the fountain of youth is to engage with young folk and listen and leaving the world a little bit better than how we found it. That's it. We're short term. We're not going to be here forever, but you live it. And like Mercedes Sosa, the great Latin American singer, used to say, and this is, I wish this for everybody at John Jay, everywhere in college, professors, high school teachers, it's solidarity. You know, she sings, ¿Quién ha dicho que todo está perdido? Yo vengo a ofrecer mi corazón. Who says that everything is lost? I'm here to offer my heart. So with that, Thank you very much. If you're interested, please look at the links, reach out to any of us, and the struggle continues in solidarity. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now. A wonderful day.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Suzanne. Be well, everyone.
Thank you. Be safe, everyone. Take care.
Yes.
It's lovely to see you all.
Yes.
Always.
Likewise. Let's do it
Abrazos.
again. Let's do it more often.
Yes, yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.